And welcome back to the final episode of Empire Building in Africa for Masters Class. We're going to jump right into the Boer War. And this is a name that is given as the Dutch settlers. Boer in their native tongue just simply means farmer, basically. Just farmer. So the Farmer War, if you will. And that's how the Boers see themselves. They had been somewhat ousted by the English. They were upset with English policy regarding, their lack of being able to use their language. The Dutch was eliminated from administrative speech and from official government language. It would be replaced by English, so they felt very rudely done by that. They also feel rudely done by the fact that the English have very strict laws against slavery. You can't use slaves. We're going to ban and outlaw slaves. So as they set up in Cape Town, what becomes the Union of South Africa, these English-controlled territories, that's when we start to see the Dutch, these Boers, these Afrikaners, those Dutch who were born in Africa here in South Africa, move a little bit further northland, and you can see from this map it says Rhodesia, but there was a time right during the Boer Wars, as we can see, they move away from Cape Colony and right in here to what they set up as the Orange Free State. And then these Boers, these Afrikaners, these Dutch South Africans, they set up in the Transvaal as well, and you can see where they kind of get the name from the Vaal River. They set up Johannesburg. And they're brushing right up against the Natal area. And this is going to be an area that's going to see a lot of confusion, a lot of strife between the Zulu peoples and the Ndebele people, or the Matabele people, as the English will come to know them. But we're going to talk a bit about the Matabele people a little bit near the end of the lecture. For now, just know that a couple things happen here. One, you might think, well, with these Dutch kind of settling into these other areas, it might be better off for all parties. But the reality is gold will be discovered in this area. Diamonds, but gold will be discovered in the area. And of course, someone like Cecil Rhodes, who we talked about in part 2, who has become something of the head of Cape Town, the prime minister, the head of government, if you will, who has established the De Beers Mining Company, along with now what's going to become the South African Mining Company. He'll set that up too. They're going to take great interest in these areas, and you can see how this is probably going to shake out. I mean, the Rhodesia name for these areas is kind of a dead giveaway. But it doesn't seem like it's going to go the way of the English at first, because as the Boer Wars first sets out, these Dutch farmers, they are, they happen to be crack shots. They are excellent marksmen, and they're great shots off of horseback too. So they're going to give the English a real run for their money. And the Boer Wars are basically broken up into two phases. The first phase is you have these more hardened individuals who are used to the territory. They're excellent marksmen, surprising marksmen. And the English, the soldiers they send over in the first Boer War, they're young, they're green, they don't have anything invested in the land, not like these Dutch farmers, these Boers. And they're just too young, they're too green, they're too inexperienced, they don't know the lay of the land, they don't have anything invested, and they are just going to basically get slaughtered. They're going to get mollywopped by these Boers. It's a real one-sided show at first. But that is eventually going to change. After an initial peace settlement, hostilities will once again pick up, instigated by Cecil Rhodes with what becomes the famous, or infamous, I should say, Jameson raid, where they basically feel as though they can just take them now's the time, let's just take them. There's gold to be had. There's diamond and other mining interests in the area that need to be exploited. So what's going to wind up happening is when we get closer to 1902, so between 1899 and 1902, we're going to see the fierce guerrilla resistance of the Boers give way to new tactics. More veteran soldiers are brought over by the English. The English are going to set up basically outposts all along the Free Orange State and the Transvaal, as much as they can anyway, stretching over to Natal. And from those outposts, they're going to heavily man them. They're going to be well supplied. They're bringing in thousands and thousands of soldiers from England to Cape Town with munitions, with supplies. They are populating these outposts, and from there they just basically engage in slash and burn kind of battle tactics, scorched earth. They're going to burn the crops, forcing the Boers to retreat further inward into the Free Orange State and the Transvaal regions. They're destroying their villages because they can't really destroy their crops. And those that they capture, they're going to force men, women, and children to what essentially become concentration camps. These white concentration camps for the Dutch, for the Boers. And the conditions are really bad. So they're often going to lack food. This causes over 20,000 deaths. Conditions are really terrible. So terrible, in fact, it doesn't take but a little bit of scrolling around and you can see instantly some of the awful conditions that existed in these Boer, well, I should say English, concentration camps for the Boers. And by 1902, the Dutch basically call it quits. And so a new peace treaty will be signed in 1902, and this is going to give the English mining interests. They're going to acquire more territory. The English language will become the official administrative language, and slavery, of course, will be done away with because the English don't tolerate that the way the Dutch do. So in 1910, the British create an independent union of South Africa. So the map goes from this right here, right, where we can see all this, to what will eventually become, in just 4 years, from 1910, that is, this. So you have the Union of South Africa, and then you'll have Rhodesia span out from there. And we're going to talk about how we get Rhodesia in a bit. But the Boer Wars is certainly one way that leads to the path to Rhodesia, if you will. So the Union of South Africa combines that old Cape Colony and those two Boer republics. And this becomes a new state, self-governing within the British Empire. Now, the problem once you conquer any territory, especially people like the Boers, who, they're natural farmers. They've been here for generations. You're not just going to be able to oust them completely. You're going to have to govern them. So they have to throw them something to appease them. So to appease the Boers, to make sure that they don't rise up in yet a third Boer War, right? The British want to avoid that at all costs, considering how costly the second operation was. They are going to agree that only whites, with a few propertied Africans, would be able to vote. And this is what I was talking a bit about in part 2 of the lecture. This is where you start to see the stripping away of rights and the ability to fully participate within African society. Because African society is now being displaced by European society as they imperialize and colonialize. So when you see those exceptions, understand that they are usually the well-to-do, the elite, the propertied Africans of society. They are chieftains. They are people of importance. And they become a representative of the old guard. They effectively what you would call buy in, and not all buy in. Many are swindled, are cheated, are taken advantage of, resist even. We'll talk about how resistance sort of fluctuates and changes as well. So let's talk about that actually with the effects of imperialism. So by 1914, right, we've seen the map. African society goes from this, right, where we just have a few interests here and there. You really see the Ottoman Empire well represented in northern Africa, and then they're completely shut out as, you know, the English in particular, but increasing European interests basically take hold of Africa. So Africa is divided up, which leaves, as we said, only Liberia and Ethiopia as the two independent, you know, nation states or countries within Africa. And Liberia is only set up because of these sort of, you know, the racist politicians and institutions that have existed in American society, and the sentiment amongst both whites and some blacks that for, you know, a formerly enslaved person of the United States, the only true way to remain free and to participate in a democratic representative-based government is to go back into Africa and to go to Liberia, which will be set up as an American colony, if you will. And this is not forced deportation of people. Those who go are known as the volunteers because it's 100% volunteer based. And of course, you'll have within American society those African Americans as well as whites who disagree with this policy, that, you know, you have to fight for equal rights and representation in this government. You shouldn't have to, but you're going to have to, clearly, because you have that old racist guard of politicians who are going to come to dominate certain positions of government after the Civil War. And so this is where the impetus of Liberia comes into play. So you have resistance, which is usually met by devastating European military force or even, you know, American force, i.e., you know, post-Civil War, but it looks a little bit different in American society than it does in African society, certainly. And then you have those who say, if you can't beat them, join them. Those few propertied Africans. You have those people that say, I'm out. Hey man, this hasn't been such a great experience overall. I'm out. And then you have those who say that we're going to stay and we're going to resist. We're going to fight. Or we take advantage of the system, learn its ways to eventually change the system. And that's also something that we're going to be talking about here. So let's go into those, you know, effects of imperialism and what colonial rule in Africa actually looks like here. Because this is going to be found, I think, as a common template that we'll see in Southeast Asia, you'll see it in India, you'll see it in African society, certainly, of those people who marginally buy in, adopt the customs, the politique, the culture, the education of Western Europe, but only so that they can eventually take control, right, to influence change. This is their form of resistance, resistance through education and politics. So, as I was mentioning, right, as it's true in Southeast Asia and in India, we see that there are certain aspects that carry over, right? So the British, they are huge fans of indirect rule, as we covered before when we talked about imperialism in Southeast Asia. So they're going to rely on those existing political elites and institutions that have been set up because it's not very costly It's the least amount of effort and expense possible to rule over a new colony that one has set up, or that one nation sets up into another nation. So this allows for the continuation of culture, of dialogue. Basically, a local ruler just has to accept, the authority, in this case, British authority, fly the flag over official buildings, basically whatever demands, commands, orders that the colonizing country has, the local ruler is to implement. And beyond that, continue about your business. So we see this in northern Nigeria, in Sokoto, beginning in 1903. They're going to be a perfect example of indirect rule. A long-established Islamic state, the British recognize, trying to really push the whole Christianity thing and spread of Christianity thing might not work so well here. To be ruled over by a Christian ruler, we don't want to disrupt local customs and institutions, so it's best to set up an indirect state, have an elite buy in to the system, and then they can enforce, they can implement and institute basically British laws, customs, if you will, but make it palatable. But this has not always worked well, right? So one, as I've noted, indirect rule, it's basically not really indirect rule. It is and it isn't. I mean, yes, local customs, institutions continue on and persist, but the very nature of it means that you're taking your orders from someone. So the British are basically going to make all the major decisions, of course, and they're going to give that to the local rulers and whatever native authorities serve under the British, who have bought into the system, right, to enforce those decisions, for which they're well compensated for. Another issue is that this creates the old African elite. So those who were in power before typically stay in power, typically, and if they didn't even, they become. The new becomes the old. You become the old guard, the old elite. As time moves on, you become a representative of the haves versus the have-nots. So this could actually squash the opportunities for ambitious, talented young Africans from outside the old elite who perhaps do buy into the system, who adopt the sort of Western European model that is now going to persist, from rising to prominent positions where they could prove to be quite beneficial. So this is ultimately going to sow the seeds of class and ethnic tensions, because you don't just have the elites of society, those who have money, those who do not have money, the poor, the working class, the middle class, the educated intelligentsia, the elites of society. You don't just have those, but you have those within tribal boundaries, because that's something important to keep in mind. As the map is being carved up by these Europeans, well, there are various tribes who occupy various parts of these lands, and when you redraw these lines, you're not necessarily, accommodating old tribal disputes or factions, or accounting for peace treaties that tribes have basically agreed to, peace settlements. I mean, these could be issues that go back for centuries, centuries, and they're not just going to be undone overnight because a new country, like a new nation like England or the Netherlands come in and they just redraw the map of Africa. They redraw the boundaries. So you could have both class and ethnic tensions. And you might even see as one tribe seems to be favored over another tribe in this new boundary that's set up by the English in particular. Well, now you're getting class being tied directly to ethnic and tribal identity. So you ever notice how, people of this tribe seem to always be in power, are educated, and they're the elites. They bought into this system. They're the shills of, this outside force. Um, and so this can become quite an issue, yes. And it's going to erupt after the various independence movements are going to sweep throughout the 20th century. This happens, the decolonization period after World War I ramps up. That's something that we might be able to get into before the end of the year, if you will. So most other European nations, they don't rule through independent or indirect rule the way that the English do. They are going to just take control through direct rule, right? We're going to have, so if you look at France as a great example, right? Sprawling territory from northwest into West and Central Africa. Well, we want to make sure that it's uniform, so we are going to send in our top French officials, typically known as the Governor General, and they are appointed from Paris. It's all very official. We govern with the aid of a bureaucracy in the capital city of a colony, and it's very much top down from there. Now, there's problems to this as well. One, you have more but here's the advantage. You have more uniformity based on what, the colonizing capital city of the colonizing nation, i.e. Paris, France, wants, right? So there's a uniformity that's going to sweep through the lands of French custom, culture, government, politics, economics, arts, education, etc. Here's the problem with all that. You don't make any effort to really preserve the culture of the indigenous people. So traditions, the traditions of the French are going to butt up against the various traditions of various Western African tribes, Central African tribes, and North African tribes as well. And as a result of this all but shuts out the vast majority of Africans being eligible to run for office and even serve in the French Assembly in Paris. Only a few will be able to do so. And fewer still are going to be appointed for high-powered positions in colonial administration. So you are re-educating, if you will. You're reincorporating people who have been in this area for centuries, if not millennium, and now you're having them to buy into the system. Well, okay, if we buy in, then you learn the language, you learn the culture, you learn the customs, you get a French education, you could enter into politics, come back home, change the game. That could happen. That could happen. And there's a likelihood of this happening as well. But again, just like with the English and indirect rule, this is, it happens, but it doesn't happen with any sort of real regularity. It's more uncommon than it is common. And this is what's going to give rise to African nationalism. The lack of opportunity, especially for those who do buy in, who do get that Western-style education, who go overseas to places like France or England. They go to the University of Oxford if they were in an English settlement, right, or Cambridge, and they receive this education and they learn more and more about democracy, republics, and the principles that these nations are founded and built on. Especially for the French, you learn about the revolutions, and then you start to look back at where you came from, and you're saying, it doesn't really feel like these ideas of democracy and equality and political freedom really apply to where I come from. It seems very much like these colonies of these Western European powers, in fact, deny as much as they can these opportunities for African peoples. In fact, there seems to be a resentment and a contempt for foreigners and for African people. So as they, learn more and more about Western ideas and institutions, there are aspects of the educated elites or the fortunately educated individuals of these African colonies who, come to maybe respect and admire Western culture and at times dislike what's going on at their own homes in their own countries. But one thing that they know for sure is that they absolutely do not tolerate this resentment for foreigners and the arrogant contempt of African peoples. They absolutely do not appreciate, and as they recognize increasingly, this gap, right? That there's the theory behind democracy, equality, and political freedom, and then there's the actual practice of it in colonial policy, and there's a massive gap. It does not seem to apply to the colonies. And this is where we start to see the resistance build up. So and it's not just the educated elites, it's not just those who are fortunate in their education and their schooling to be recognized, obtain scholarships, be allowed opportunities to receive a higher education overseas in Europe. They're not the only ones who notice these discrepancies. You'll also find that the working class and the poor will make note of this too, as they are not able to fully, participate in these democratic institutions. So native peoples could only have low-paying jobs in colonial bureaucracy. And for many Africans, just like in Southeast Asia in particular, colonialism meant, drawing new lines and obtaining farmlands from people and redistributing them. It meant working on plantations or even in factories. Once again, low-paying jobs, long hours, very burdensome and difficult working conditions. And for some who were leaders, and we'll talk about one, Lobengula, in just a moment, it could even mean losing the rights to mine for natural resources and therefore all of your land and territory. Now, the middle class, and this is where things kind of have something of an education or a valuable skill set. Maybe you are the son or daughter of an educated elite of society. Maybe you've worked hard, you've received an education to get where you're at. And so they notice that, they aren't as bad off as some, but there's still plenty you can complain about. One of which is, usually not being only qualified for the menial jobs in government or business. Salaries often being lower than that of Europeans who work in similar jobs. And much like in certain aspects of American society, certainly pre-Civil War, but also post in Jim Crow South, there is a lot of segregation, particularly in South African society. We see it in the clubs and schools and churches. And that segregation is primarily due to the assumed superiority that these white Europeans feel that they have over the indigenous peoples, the native Africans of these colonies that they set up shop in. And they do so because as European officials increasingly bring over their wives, their children, loved ones, they begin to raise families, they don't want to commingle is what is going on here. And oftentimes they're condescending even in what you might even describe as more positive relationships, as Europeans have a habit of addressing Africans by their first names, even if they had a distinguished title, if they were in a position of respectable authority, such as being a doctor, a physician, if you will, a professor, an educator. or if they were just on the job as a coworker, instead of Mr. This, Miss That, or Mrs. So-and-so, it would just be the first name. And this is where you get these ideas that stem from not just the working class and the poor and the middle class, but it's all around. It hits the educated elites of society as well. And this in turn leads to ideas and thoughts and expressions that will make up a new urban educated class. There's a great confusion toward the colonial rulers. What is civilization? What do these colonists actually represent in these societies? And as I mentioned before, and you'll find in the text, there are those educated Africans who really do find aspects of Western culture to be more attractive than their own. If you came from an area that, historically speaking, you belong to perhaps, or had tied lineage to a certain tribe that was subjugated by one tribe that typically and historically had all the power, and then this Western power comes in, colonizes, and now this tribe, this lineage your people used to belong to, is now put into positions of authority. Perhaps they bought in. They have a greater chance of, serving in governmental capacities as educators, as pillars of their community. You might buy in. You have a chance to receive an education you normally wouldn't have. You might buy into those aspects. You might even look around and say, this local culture custom seems very outdated. It doesn't align with the sentiments of the 19th to early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century. And I would wish that for my people to adopt this certain culture or custom. But the idea here is that although you might admire a certain aspect as an African of Western culture, you don't necessarily want it to be as a result of colonial rule. An intellectual typically wants to assert their own nationality, their own cultural destiny. The right of self-determination is a natural right for all people everywhere. And if you find that you admire a custom or a culture of another society, would it not be best to let people of that culture, of that society that has been colonized, to self-determine if they would like, if they would need to, if they would find it advantageous to adopt the custom or the culture from the outside society, in this case the colonizing society. But by nature, by virtue of colonization, the only way that this aspect is introduced is through these new education systems as a result of colonization. So this creates a mixture of hopes and resentments. This creates real complicated feelings as you have to reconcile, the past with the present and what the future can bring. So this is what's going to lead to those first stirrings of modern nationalism, African society. We recognize that we have been colonized. We recognize that things are not equal. They're not right. Opportunities are limited. There is clear racism. And it comes in the form of politics, right? The stripping away of the rights of people to vote, with the exception of a few, once again, propertied Africans, and sometimes not at all. And this is what's going to lead to action. So as we get more into the 20th century, especially after World War I, we're going to start to see the decolonization movements. So in Africa, that looks like taking the Western-style education that, the educated elites and intellectuals of society, of African society, have obtained, and then and whatever cultures that they find admirable about the West, and trying to self-determine and influence change, basically by creating an Africa for Africans in a new age, organizing political parties and movements to end foreign rule, to seek independence and the right to self-determination. And we're going to end it with this primary source. So the path to Rhodesia, the path to colonization, this mirrors what's going on in American society after, really during the Jacksonian era, the presidency of Andrew Jackson, and after after the Revolutionary War, after the War of 1812, we start to see increasingly, after the Louisiana Purchase, when the Haitian Revolution is successful, preventing Napoleon from taking Haiti, he is forced to quit on his American dreams, as it were. And so he sells the Louisiana Purchase, right, to make up for the loss of the Haitian, trying to put down the Haitian Revolution. And with that increased territory in American society came the swindling of Native Americans, of false land and peace treaties, of people who have an oral tradition, right? They don't read, they don't write, they pass on their knowledge and wisdom through the spoken word. This is true, too, of most African tribes. And we're going to see this with this individual right here, Lobengula. His name roughly translates in English to something like the Eater of Men. And he rules from Bulawayo. He rules over the Matabele people. And Bulawayo, even his capital that he rules from, translates in English to something like the place for killing, or the people of slaughter. And the Matabele, or as they are known, the Ndabele people, are known as the people of tall spears, the people of tall shields, because they are originally founded by Lobengula's father, right here, who served as a general under Shaka Zulu of the Zulu land, and they adopt their customs militarily speaking. Well, Lobengula is going to find himself across a representative of Cecil Rhodes by the name of Rudd, Charles Rudd. And he says this of him to Queen Victoria in a letter that is going to be sent out to her. Because keep in mind, he cannot read or write. He has to instruct others to do so on his behalf. Quote, "Some time ago a party of men came to my country, the principal one appearing to be a man called Rudd. They asked me for a place to dig for gold, and said they would give me certain things for the right to do so, primarily things like firearms, ammunition, playing on, warlike nature of this tribe to help them, combat and conquer other tribes to gain more power, that sort of thing." It continues. "I told them to bring what they could give, and I would show them what I would give." Basically, he thought he was going to give, a small handful of mines that they could mine in. That's about it. It continues. "A document was written and presented to me for signature. I asked what it contained and was told that in it were my words and the words of those men. I put my hand to it. About 3 months afterwards, I heard from other sources that I had given by the document the right to all the minerals of my country." End quote. They swindled him. And this is something that I had to mention. It mirrors so well what was going on in American society, of what was going on with the Native Americans in the West, as what is happening here in South Africa, and in other places of Africa as well, no doubt, in other regions. And this, of course, led to conflict, where ultimately Lobengula and the Matabele land of the Matabele people are defeated. And this is where we start to see Rhodesia in what will become modern-day Zimbabwe. And this breeds a people, as I mentioned, who either buy in or resist. But one thing's for certain: this European culture is going to be placed and forced upon these Africans, and whether they buy in or resist, they're going to learn and interact and participate, willingly or unwillingly, into this system. And it's through here where you have that mixture of emotions, of nationalism, of resentment, of hopes, of Western education with African culture and historicity and society slam into each other, they meet. And this is going to lead to decolonization and nationalism that's going to bleed in the early 20th century, particularly after World War I. But more on that another time. That will conclude empire building in Africa. Take it easy, folks.